Montana Territory, August of 1879. The sun dipped low over the Bitterroot River, casting long shadows across the dusty bank as 18-year-old Florence Thorne knelt in the soft earth, her hands trembling around a tiny shovel. The doll in front of her was worn, one glass eye missing, the other cloudy with age, its cloth body patched and stained from too many years and too many hands. She pressed her lips together to stop their quiver, then began scooping dirt into a shallow hole. Behind her, hooves slowed. The quiet crunch of boots in dry grass followed. Florence did not turn. "You do not have to bury everything you love," a low voice said, quiet but certain. She froze, her fingers, coated in dirt, clenched into fists. "She is all I had left of them." The cowboy stepped closer, his shadow falling across the doll's small grave. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who moved like he had seen too much and carried it all behind his eyes. His hat was pushed back, revealing dark brown hair and a scar that ran just above his brow. His name was Elias Fletcher, and he had not meant to come across anyone out here. He had just been riding toward the mountain pass, hoping to outrun something of his own. Florence finally looked up. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried tears, her blue eyes too old for someone so young. Elias crouched beside her. "Who did you lose?" She swallowed. "My children." The words hit the air like a shot. She looked away fast, choking on the silence that followed. Elias's voice stayed calm, but something in it cracked. "You are not much older than a child yourself." "I am 20, she said. "I was 16 when I had my son, 18 when my daughter came. Now I am 20. And they are both gone." He did not speak. He just waited. She kept her eyes on the river. "Their names were Peter and Pearl. They were taken from me last fall. I never saw them again. The matron at the mission said it would be better for them, that I could not provide, said I was too young, unfit." She blinked hard. "I carried that doll from Missouri all the way here. It was Pearl's favorite. I thought if I buried it, maybe I could stop waking up thinking I still had them." Elias lowered his gaze to the half-filled grave. "That doll does not need to go in the ground for you to love them less. You do not have to bury everything to move forward." Florence shook her head, her jaw set. "You do not understand. I lost my wife in childbirth," he said simply. 6 years ago. She was 19. I buried her on a ridge outside of Laramie. I could not save her, but I still wear her ring around my neck." His hand went to the leather cord beneath his shirt. Florence looked at him, wet lashes lifted. "I am sorry," she said. Elias nodded. "Me too." They sat in silence by the river, the wind whispering through the cottonwoods. The sky darkened slowly, stars beginning to blink into place above them. "You have somewhere to be?" she asked. He tilted his head. "Was heading toward Missoula. Got word of work writing dispatch for the army near Fort Missoula. Thought I might take it." Florence bit her lip. "I was following the river west. No plan. Just walking." Elias studied her. "You have no money, no horse, no supplies." She looked down. "Then you will ride with me," he said. "What?" She blinked. "I will take you as far as you want to go. You do not need to bury your past to find something new ahead. I do not even know you. You do not have to. But you are not staying out here alone." Florence hesitated, her heart pounding. She had met too many men who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. Elias was not smiling at all. He just looked honest, tired, solid. "I will ride," she said quietly. He stood and held out a hand. She took it and rose to her feet. Before she turned away from the grave, she reached down, lifted the doll, and tucked it into the satchel slung across her shoulder. They rode double on his horse until the moon was high, stopping only when they found a clearing near the river with enough dry ground for a fire. Elias moved with quiet efficiency, collecting brushwood, striking flint, setting a pot of coffee to boil in the flames while Florence laid out a blanket and sat cross-legged beside it. She watched him from the corner of her eye. His hands were worn but steady. His face, even in firelight, held a kind of sorrow that matched her own. "You are kind," she said at last. "I am just doing what I hope someone would do for my sister if she were out here." Florence looked over. "Do you have a sister?" "Had one. Emily. She died from fever when I was 15. I was supposed to watch her while my folks were out. I stepped away for 10 minutes. When I got back, she was shaking and burning up. She never came out of it." Florence's eyes softened. Elias looked into the fire. "We all carry graves inside us. But that does not mean we have to live in them." She was quiet a long time after that. Then, barely above a whisper, she asked, "Do you believe people like us get another chance?" He looked straight at her, his voice low. "I think maybe this is it." Florence wrapped her arms around her knees. "I have not told anyone about Peter and Pearl. Not in months. It hurt too much." "You needed someone to hear it," Elias said. They sat in the hush of night, the fire popping softly between them. Eventually, her head drooped and she dozed, her cheek against her knees. Elias stood, lifted a spare blanket from his pack, and draped it over her gently. Then he settled beside the fire, his rifle across his knees, and watched the trees. He did not know how long she would stay, but something in him already hoped she would not leave. Not yet, not ever. The morning rose pale and gold through lodgepole pine, mist clinging low over the river like breath held too long. Elias had already seen to the horse and boiled water for coffee before Florence stirred beneath the blanket. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, then sat up slowly, brushing dried grass from her skirt. The fire had burned to coals, red and pulsing. "You sleep heavy," Elias said without turning. "I haven't in months," she replied, rubbing the back of her neck. "I didn't mean to last night." He passed her a tin cup, steam curling from its rim. "You needed it." She took it carefully, her hands still marked with yesterday's dirt. "I should earn my way." "You will." Florence glanced toward the saddlebag where she'd tucked the doll. She didn't reach for it. "I can sew, mend things, and I can read. I taught my daughter her letters." She was just starting to sound out her own name before she stopped. "I won't speak of it again." Elias nodded once. "There's a trading post near Frenchtown. We can stop there. Might be work patching clothes or helping in the mercantile. Folks always need something. I'm not looking for pity. Wasn't offering it." She sipped the bitter coffee, eyes on the treeline. "You always travel alone?" "Since the war ended." Her gaze flicked to him. "You were in it?" "Infantry. Union side. Missouri Regiment. Saw 3 winters and more men die of fever than bullets." "I never asked where you were from." "South of Rolla," he said. "Farm country. Nothing left of it now." She nodded, silent. "You?" "Hickory County," she said. "My father died in '67. My mother remarried a man with fists instead of words. I left when I was 15. They didn't speak for a while after that. The quiet between them no longer felt like something to cover up. By midday, they reached a narrow trail that cut away from the river and joined the road north. Florence rode behind him again, light but steady in the saddle. She didn't hold tight to him, but she didn't shrink away either. "Do you trust easily?" she asked, her voice close to his ear. "No," he said, "but I know when someone's not looking to steal or lie. That's not the same as trust." "No," he agreed, "but it's a start." They passed a buckboard going the other direction, a man and his wife waving from beneath a canvas shade. Florence raised her hand in return, then watched them disappear behind a rise. "I used to picture that," she said. "A wagon. A husband who listened, children without fear." Elias didn't answer. After a while, she asked, "Do you think you'll marry again?" "I don't carry that kind of plan." "You don't carry much of anything," she said, glancing at his saddlebags. He gave a half shrug. "Only what I need." Florence looked ahead at the winding trail. "And what do you need, Elias Fletcher?" He didn't answer right away. Then, space enough to breathe. Place where nobody's screaming. A hand that doesn't flinch when it's close. Florence's voice lowered. "That last part me too." By dusk, they reached a rise overlooking a shallow valley. Smoke curled from a cabin's chimney in the distance, and the spire of a small church rose just beyond it. "We'll camp down there," Elias said. "Land's flat, and there's creek water." As they made their way down, Florence noticed he kept her slightly behind him, one hand near his rifle. It wasn't showy, just habit. Watching the ridges, listening for breaks in the brush. "Do you ever stop looking over your shoulder?" she asked. "If you've lived long enough, you learn to look both ways." They made camp near the creek, and she helped gather dry moss and pine cones for the fire. When she struck the flint, Elias watched her hands steady. Practiced. "You've fended for yourself," he said. Florence didn't look up. No one else was going to. Later, as the fire danced low and the stars pressed down bright and watchful, she sat cross-legged, elbows on her knees. "I could go on from Frenchtown," she said. "There's a boarding house in Missoula that sometimes takes women. I'd have a cot, at least." "You could," Elias said. "Or you could ride a little farther with me. See what work turns up." She looked across the fire at him. "Why?" "Because sometimes company's better than silence." She didn't answer. The fire crackled between them, and somewhere in the dark, a night bird called once, then fell quiet. Elias leaned back on his elbows. "You ever seen Flathead Lake?" She shook her head. "It's big enough to carry 100 worries. Cold, clear water. Pines all around it. I knew a man once who said if you could stand barefoot in it come spring thaw, you'd forget everything bad that ever happened." "Did you try it?" "No, why not? I was afraid I'd forget her." Florence looked down at her hands. "What happens if you remember and it still hurts? Then it's part of you, but it doesn't have to be all of you." She nodded once, as if folding the thought away. That night she didn't sleep against her knees. She stretched out beneath the blanket, her back to the fire, and let her breath slow into the rhythm of the creek. Elias stayed awake a while longer, watching the shadows shift in the trees. He didn't reach for anything, didn't speak into the dark, just listened to the quiet and let it settle. In the hush between them, something unspoken began to take root. Not born from pity, not fed by need, but from the simple fact that they were still here, still breathing, and no longer alone. By the fourth day, the trail bent westward through a stretch of lowland where the trees grew in tight clusters and the air smelled of damp moss and pine resin. The road was quieter here, less traveled, the ruts shallow and fading into grass. Elias dismounted once to check the horse's hoof, and Florence used the moment to gather wild mint growing by a fence post, tucking the sprigs into her satchel. "You know plants?" Elias asked, brushing dust from his sleeve. "My mother did," she said. "She used to say God gave us herbs before he gave us doctors. Mint for belly, yarrow for blood, willow for fever. She kept jars of it all stacked under the bed." "She's still living?" Florence stood. "No. She passed the winter after I left. A neighbor sent word." Elias didn't ask more. He lifted her back into the saddle and they pressed on. That evening, they stopped beside a dry creek where cottonwoods leaned in close, their leaves chattering softly even without wind. Elias worked on reshaping a bent stirrup while Florence gathered stones for a fire ring, setting them in a careful circle. Her hands moved without hesitation, her fingers no longer raw from disuse. "You always that precise?" Elias asked. "Only when I feel unsettled," she replied, not looking up. "You unsettled now?" Florence placed the last stone. "I don't know what to do with the feeling of safety." Elias set the stirrup down. "You think this is safety? It's more than I've had in a long time." She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her apron. "When I first followed the river, I didn't think I'd last the week. I told myself I'd walk until my feet bled or my heart gave out. And now, I'm still walking." They sat across the fire from each other that night, their supper plain beans, cornbread, a bit of dried apple. Florence chewed slowly, her eyes distant. "I used to hum when I cooked," she said suddenly. "Peter would sit on the floor beside me, banging on whatever pot I wasn't using. Pearl would crawl over and pull at my skirt until I picked her up." Elias tilted his head, listening. "I haven't made a sound in months," she said. "Not even a hum." He didn't press her. He only said, "You could start again." She didn't answer, but the next morning, while tending the fire, she let out a single note, thin, uncertain. Not a tune, just the start of one. Elias didn't mention it. They reached Frenchtown by late morning, where the road widened and the smell of smoked meat drifted from a small trading post. A freckle-faced man with a bad limp tended the porch, watching them approach with one eye squinted. "Need supplies," Elias said. "Any work for a girl with sewing hands?" The man jerked his thumb toward a side building. "My sister runs the laundry. She'll take help if it's offered honest." Florence dismounted and looked to Elias. "You going to wait? I'll see to the horse. Meet you back here." The sun had shifted by the time she returned, sleeves pushed up and damp with soap. Her expression was unreadable. "She pays in coin," Florence said, "and she doesn't ask questions." Elias offered a nod. "That suit you?" "For now." They made camp just outside town, in a grove near an old fence line where wild roses tangled in the wire. Florence sat on a fallen log, threading a needle by firelight. "I stitched Pearl's blankets by hand," she said, eyes on her work. "She used to drag one around behind her, even in summer. It got so dirty I had to boil it just to keep the lice off." Elias poured water into the tin basin. "You ever think of finding them again?" Florence didn't look away from the needle. "Every day. But I wouldn't know where to start. The mission's gone, burned last winter. No records, no names." "You'd still try?" She nodded once. "If I had a direction." Elias leaned back against his saddle. "You got grit. Most folks don't know what to do with it. They think it makes a person hard." "I don't feel hard," she said. "I feel hollow." He looked at her then, long and quiet. "Hollow things can be filled." She set her sewing down. "With what?" "Whatever you choose." The fire threw shadows across her face, softening the lines around her mouth. She picked up the needle again, but her hands moved slower now. "Would you keep riding if I asked?" she asked without looking at him. Elias's voice was low. "You asking?" She nodded just once. "Then I'll ride," he said. "As long as you want." She folded the cloth in her lap. "It's not love. Not yet." "No," he agreed. "But it's something." Florence stood, brushing off her skirt. "Then let's build something. Even if it's slow." Elias stood too. "Slow's fine by me." She reached for the doll in her satchel, the one with the missing eye. She didn't speak as she set it on the blanket beside her, but she didn't turn away either. Elias looked at the doll, then at her. "You keeping her with you now?" Florence nodded. "She's not a grave. She's a memory." He stepped closer, not touching, just standing near enough to feel the warmth between them. You don't have to bury everything you love. I know, she said. I'm learning. They didn't kiss. They didn't hold hands. But they stood side by side until the fire burned low, and when they lay down that night, it was under the same blanket. Not out of need, but out of choosing. The ground climbed west into low hills where the trees spread wide and the air grew thinner, sharper. Late summer heat still clung to the valley below, but here, wind moved through the grass in long sighs, and the earth smelled of stone and sun-warmed sage. Florence walked beside the horse now, her skirt hitched to her knees as she stepped over uneven ground. Elias led the way ahead, reins loose in hand, his eyes marking the trail. You ever go back to Missouri? She asked, watching the way his boots pressed prints into the dust. No, why? He kept walking. Nothing there I want to see again. Florence adjusted the strap of her satchel. I think about it sometimes. Not home, just the road I took away from it. I wonder what would have changed if I'd turned a different direction. Some roads only go one way, Elias said. She nodded, then pointed toward a ridge where a narrow trail veered off beneath a rock outcropping. What's up there? Old mining camp, played out years ago. Just shacks and rusted pans now. Ever stop and look? He glanced over. You want to? No, she said, then smiled faintly. Just wondering if you ever do anything without a reason. Elias slowed, glancing toward the trail. I used to ride just to ride. Before the war. Before her. Florence didn't press. Instead, she reached for a stalk of dry grass and twisted it between her fingers. I used to think I'd live my whole life in one place. I thought the world was only as big as the church steeple and the edge of the corn rows. You still believe that? No, she said. Now I think the world's too big to understand. But you can carve out a place in it and make it yours. Elias looked back at her. You thinking of carving? I might be. They made camp in a hollow where cottonwoods leaned close and a spring bubbled up clear from between two slabs of stone. Florence rolled her sleeves and knelt to rinse the dust from her hands, watching the water swirl dark around her fingers. Elias took off his hat and set it beside his bedroll. You ever think about staying put? Florence pushed her wet hair behind her ear. Not until lately. He crouched beside her, filling the canteen. What changed? You, she said. And me. Together it feels different. She didn't look at him when she said it, but her voice held steady. Elias capped the canteen slowly, then sat back on his heels. I never thought I'd have it again. The wanting. The ease. Florence sat, arms looped around her knees. I'm not sure it's ease, but it's something close. I keep waiting for the world to take it away again. Then don't give it the chance, she said. He reached for her hand, not sudden, not unsure. She let him take it, fingers threading through his. Her palm was rough in places, the skin at her knuckles pale with old scars. There's a town near the lake, Elias said. Not big, but it's got a smith, a schoolhouse, a dry goods store. Folks there keep to themselves. You been? Couple years back. Thought I might settle. But I wasn't ready. And now? He looked at her, quiet. Maybe I am. Florence tilted her head. You think they'd take a woman like me? I think they'd take a woman who works hard, keeps her word, and doesn't owe anyone nothing. She nodded slowly. Then maybe that's where we'll go. They didn't speak much after that. Florence cooked beans with dried onion and a pinch of salt from a pouch she'd traded for in Frenchtown. Elias whittled a piece of pine into something that looked like it might become a spoon, though he didn't say what he was making. When night came, they lay beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the edge of the world. Florence turned toward him in the dark. If I ask you something, will you answer honest? I will. Would you have stopped that day if you hadn't seen me burying her? He was quiet a long moment. I'd have passed by, but I'd have turned back. I'd have known something was wrong. Seeing a girl like you kneeling in the dirt alone. I wasn't a girl. You were hurting, he said. That's what I saw first. Florence reached for the edge of his coat and held it between her fingers. I'm not afraid anymore. Neither am I. They fell asleep close, not tangled, just near enough to feel the warmth of one another. And when morning came, they didn't speak of the past. They packed their things, mounted the horse, and turned toward the lake. Toward the place he had left behind once, and she had never dared imagine. They didn't need to speak the word for what was growing between them. It was already real, already theirs. The trail to the lake carried the scent of fir needles and old wood smoke, and the wind off the water came cold even in late summer. They rode without hurry, the ground soft beneath the horses' hooves. The trees thinning the closer they came to the clearing Elias remembered. A church bell rang faint in the distance, one slow toll. Florence raised her chin at the sound. Someone died. No, Elias said. They ring it for weddings, too. Midday, one chime. She looked past him toward the small town tucked beside the lake. Seems quiet. It is. They passed a man mending a fence with wire and rawhide. He nodded to them but said nothing. A child stood barefoot nearby, holding a bucket of nails. Elias tipped his hat, and the boy watched them disappear down the road without blinking. Florence's voice was low. They don't ask questions here. They don't need to. They stopped at a small house with a cedar shake roof, set back from the road behind a split rail fence covered in pale lichen. The windows were shuttered against the sun, but the door stood open, and a woman with gray streaked braids knelt in the garden, pulling beets from the dirt. Elias dismounted and tied the reins loosely to the fence. Ruth, he said. She shielded her eyes. Well, look what the wind dragged home. I came to ask about the cabin. She stood, brushing her hands against her apron. Still standing. Needs a new roof and a door that doesn't swing in the wind. But the bones are sound. Florence stayed beside the saddle, uncertain. Ruth glanced at her. You bringing help or trouble? Elias looked at Florence. Help. Then you're welcome. Florence stepped down from the horse, her back straight. Thank you. Ruth nodded once. You'll find the key where it's always been, under the stone marked with a cross. If it's gone, someone else beat you to it. They walked the last stretch on foot. The cabin stood at the edge of a bluff, where the trees opened to a view of the lake, wide and still as glass. The door hung crooked, and smoke hadn't risen from the chimney in years, but the porch stood firm, and the shutters banged gently in the breeze. Florence stepped onto the porch first and lifted the stone. The key waited beneath it, rusted but whole. Inside, dust lay thick, and a mouse darted from the corner when Elias pushed the door open. A small hearth sat cold against the north wall, and a pine table leaned slightly on one leg. Florence ran her fingers along the windowsill. This is yours. Was my brother's. He built it after the war. Died of lung fever before he could finish the floor. She knelt and touched the edge of the plank. He did good work. Elias leaned against the doorframe. We can make it better. They cleaned for hours. Florence swept out nests and cobwebs, her sleeves rolled, her hair tied back with twine. Elias patched the door with a handsaw and a strip of oak he found behind the shed. By evening, the hearth burned low and steady, and the table stood level. Florence curled her legs beneath her on the bench and held her hands near the flame. I never thought I'd call a place mine. Elias poured water into a tin basin. It is if you stay. She turned toward him, her eyes tired but clear. I'm not leaving. He stepped closer and crouched before her. I want to build this with you, not just the roof or the walls. But the rest. She reached out and touched the edge of his collar. I know it's not love yet, but I know what it could be. He took her hand, pressing it to his chest. It's growing. That's enough for me. Outside, wind moved through the tall grass. Inside, the fire snapped softly. Florence whispered, "Ask me." Elias didn't hesitate. "Stay with me. Not just the night. All of it." She smiled, slow and sure. "I already said yes." That winter, they fixed the roof with cedar shakes and patched the draft beneath the door. Florence traded mending work for oilcloth and beeswax, and Elias hunted elk in the higher ridges, bringing back meat to last them through the cold months. They hung lavender in the rafters and stitched thick curtains from old flour sacks. Florence planted sweet onions in early spring and learned to fish the lake's shallows with a hand line. Elias carved a cradle from pine, smooth and sturdy, then waited until the snow finally melted to say what he'd known for weeks. "I want a family with you." Florence didn't answer with words. She took his hand and pressed it over her belly. By summer, the townsfolk no longer looked twice when they passed. Ruth brought preserves in jars sealed with wax, and the bell tolled again this time for them. They stood before the church with pine needles caught in her veil and ash on his boots from the morning's fire. And when the child came red-faced and strong-lunged, they named her Pearl, not from sorrow, but from memory made bright again. Florence stood at the door one morning, the lake glowing beneath a pale sky. Elias came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You happy? I'm home." His lips brushed her hair. "So am I." They built a life not from forgetting, but from choosing, day by day, piece by piece. And it held.